So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual seminar on microplastics. So this event is a collaboration between UQ Sustainability Office and UQ Marine, and it's exclusive to UQ students and staff. So the event will be recorded for future viewing, so make sure to follow the different channels of UQ Sustainability, but also of UQ Marine. They've got different channels in social media, much fun to follow, and then you can be notified when this event has been uploaded as well. So I would like to begin acknowledging the Jagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. And if you're near UQ, that is, and also the traditional owners of the lands where all other attendees that are zooming in today are currently watching from as well. We pay our respects to their ancestors and to their descendants who continue their spiritual and cultural connection to land, sea, and community. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. My name is Daria Gurer. I'm a lecturer in Earth and Marine Sciences here at UQ, also a member of UQ Marine and the Centre for Marine Science. So I'm your MC today, and I'm joined by Emily Conn, who is a Bachelor in Environmental Science student at UQ, and she's also the Green Programs Assistant at UQ. And recently she's been joining us on a voyage that was led by UQ in the Coral Sea Marine Park, where one of the research objectives was to sample marine microplastics, and that's how we fit into this. So it's a passion for us. I'll start just do some housekeeping. And so the seminar today will run as a number of consecutive presentations. We have a number of exciting speakers lined up here today. There are our microplastics experts. If you have any questions during the session, please put those in the Q&A for the end. At the end, we hope we have some time for Q&A at the end. And each speaker will be on the call after the presentation as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of today, Professor Kevin Thomas. Thomas is the director of the Queensland Alliance for Environmental Health and Sciences at the University of Queensland. Together with his research teams and an international as well as national network of collaborators and research partners, Kevin has pioneered novel approaches to further understand the fate, exposures, and risk of environmental contaminants, including plastics. Today, Kevin will give us an overview of microplastics and important considerations to remember throughout the seminar. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us today.
Thanks for the introduction. And I'm basically going to give an overview of microplastics, define what microplastics are, and really how the science has evolved since around 15 years ago when we first started working on microplastics as contaminants of emerging concern in the environment. Contamination in the environment, if we move to the next slide, please. Contamination in the environment with plastics is really recognized as one of the most widespread and long-lasting influences on our planet. And the vast majority of the 8.3 billion tons of plastic that's been produced since 1950, as you see on this figure, still exists in our natural systems. And even the most ambitious contemporary waste reduction programs, even if they're put in place, this legacy contamination will continue to grow, along with, as you see, production on this figure. Global plastics production has really steadily increased from the 1950s, and even my lifetime, if you look at the figure around 1970, where production was around 50 million tons a year, it's grown now to 400 million tons at today's rates. And much of this increase really has been driven from the mid-1990s, especially with increased production in cheap polyolefin plastics, typically used in single-use products. And this is estimated to account by some to be around 50% of what is manufactured. The best estimates is what's released into the oceans is around 8 million tons of what's produced every year is dumped into oceans, But really, we're at the start of a journey. We're only starting to understand the complexity of the environmental plastics issue. So if we move to the next one. So where did we start in terms of microplastic research? We started really with this paper in 2004 from two professors from the University of Plymouth in the UK. The one on the left is Professor Steve Rowland. He was my PhD supervisor. And him, together with a colleague, Richard Thompson, on the right, they wrote this seminal paper where they asked the question, where is all the plastic? And what they did was they looked at sediments around the United Kingdom, and they found small quantities of very small pieces of plastic. And they, for the first time, coined the term microplastic. And this is where it all started. Next slide. And this is what microplastics look like. This is work from a student that I worked with in Scandinavia. And we looked at the stomachs of over 250 Atlantic cod. And these were bits of plastic all extracted from the stomach of these cod. So you see various polymers, various bundles of fibers, for instance, strips, even nurdles. So you see down third from the left, a styrene acetonitrile resin nurdle, all present in the stomachs of these fish. Typically, we define microplastics as pieces of plastic below 5 millimeter. And more recently, we've started to define nanoplastics, those plastics that are below 1 micron in size. Although these definitions are very kind of fluid, with very little consensus in the community as to what is actually a nanoplastic really to date. Next slide. And then the microplastic community likes to identify plastics as two different types, really. The first, which is commonly called primary microplastics, they're plastics that are released directly into the environment in the form that they're produced. And this is most easily explained by plastics, for instance, that are found in personal care products or toothpaste, that when you use them, they wash down the drain into the sewer network and out into the environment. Then there are secondary microplastics, which tend to be the environmental degradation products of larger macroplastic items that are disposed of or end up in the environment and break down, fragment, weather over time to form smaller fragments. And the environment is essentially contaminated with large amounts of both primary and secondary microplastics in various stages of weathering and various stages of kind of oxidation. If we move on. So measuring microplastics is something that's been done since that first paper in 2004, but really, as identified by the World Health Organization in 2019, they concluded that the majority of the microplastic occurrence studies to date really are not fully reliable, and that there's really a need to improve the quality of assurance of an occurrence of microplastic studies. And this was something that we kind of understood very early in our research. And we've been kind of developing complementary techniques to effectively and accurately quantify the amounts of plastics in the environment, with the end goal of trying to work out where they're coming from and what happens to them. If you look at the right, there's kind of a number of size thresholds that I've shown. And really this is to illustrate that the smaller we go, the increasing amount of uncertainty there is with our measurements, and the increasingly challenging it is to actually measure these plastics in environmental samples. So these limits really that I've put there, highlighted between 1 nanometer and 150 micrometers, really as the thresholds where it kind of hampers progress to some extent. We see 10 micrometers as really a key threshold, because that's quite important in terms of where we think the smaller plastics that may have an impact, for instance, on human health may exist. And then there's the range between 20 and 50 micron, where these are the size ranges that most of the conventional measurement techniques that I'll touch upon later on actually work at. And even though the expert laboratories can use techniques to the very lower levels of their capabilities of identifying, it's very hard to go essentially below around 150 micron. And there are really challenges there. And we're only starting to understand through interlaboratory comparison studies, for instance, as to how good we are at measuring low levels of very small plastics in environmental samples. Next slide. So this seminar is really timely in terms of the figure that I've got here that I borrowed from a Nature News article from last week. Really shows the scale of microplastics and nanoplastics in terms of size. So showing the different sizes that we see. At the bottom part of the pane shows you the typical techniques that are used. Going from right to left, we see greater than 1 millimeter is possible to use the naked eye. Greater than 100 micrometers, optical microscopes are used. Greater than 10 to 20 micrometers, although it's quite fluid in terms of the FTIR and Raman techniques as to where they actually lie in terms of the size boundary, but they're somewhere between 1 micron and 100 micron, I would say, in terms of their ability to identify and accurately identify which polymer there are. And then below 1 micron, you have the pyrolysis GCMS techniques that our group here at the University of Queensland mainly use for our research. Typically operates in anything below 1 micrometer, but we would say that in terms of extracting plastics from environmental samples, we can certainly go bigger than that. So to give you an idea as to the different sizes that we have in terms of microplastics, they range from the whole range of a copepod, fish eggs and larvae, all the way down to very small particles that may cross, for instance, the blood-brain barrier at those smaller ranges. But there have been very few studies to date that have even identified the presence or occurrence of sub 1 micron particles in the environment. Next slide, please. So how has the research evolved since 2004? Well, Chelsea Rochman wrote this really nice piece of work. Chelsea's from the University of Toronto in Canada and has been really at the forefront of microplastics research. And in this opinion piece from Science back in 2018, she confirmed what most of us were thinking at the time, is that microplastics just aren't an issue for the oceans. They really are everywhere. And wherever we go and look for plastics, we actually can find them. And the trend in research really has been, since the ocean plastics work of 2004, I guess, through to around 5 years ago, is to look in different environments. And really that's where our research has been to date, is looking at more the terrestrial and the atmospheric environments to see where we can identify plastics. And most of this plastics at the end of the day will make its way through various processes into the oceans. At the same time, a recent paper by a group from Norway, Bank and Hansen and colleagues, 2 years ago, they coined the term the environmental plastic cycle. And the cycle above really is my interpretation, very simplistically, of where we have leakage of plastics through mechanisms that we don't currently fully understand into the environment. They may be in the micro size range. They're additives, which I haven't really touched upon. These plastics just aren't individual polymers. They're complex mixtures of polymers at various stages of weathering with additives present, will leach and interact with the environment. And as they're transported, they become aged, break down into smaller nanoplastics, and this cycle continues. And really that's where we're at the moment in terms of the front cutting edge line of trying to understand in terms of microplastics research. And when I say microplastics, I also mean the nanoplastics, that we're dealing with an increasingly complex mixture of plastics and additives that transform in the environment in ways that we can't predict. And we don't really understand the pathways of how those plastics are making their way into the environment. And that's very much where our research is at the moment. So to give you an idea of where we estimate plastics make their way into the world's oceans, I'll take this from a report from a few years back. A very small amount of these primary microplastics are in the form of personal care products, and they make up around 2%. You're probably very familiar with this term, nurdles, plastic pellets. They make up a very small amount, around 0.3%. Synthetic textiles from washing machines, from the weathering of synthetic surfaces, they can make up around 35% of what enters the ocean. And one of the big ones that was recently kind of not even kind of thought about was actually tire wear and how that makes its way into the environment. And there are really specific challenges with quantifying tire wear versus some of the other plastics, which if anyone's interested, we can have a chat about online later. City dust. City dust contains an amazing amount of plastic, and we just published a paper recently where we show that the streets of Brisbane have around 3/4 of a ton at any point in time of plastics lying on the streets. So they make up, when they're washed off into the oceans, around 24% of the total input. And road markings, they contain a lot of polymeric substances. As they wear with the tire wear, they make their way into the environment, into the marine environment. And finally, marine coatings, an area which I started my research career over 25 years ago, actually looking at paint particles coming off ships. They actually do account for quite a lot of the polymeric material that makes its way into the environment. So we have a handle of what's actually going into the environment. We're really understanding in what form, kind of what chemical form and what additives and other chemicals are associated with these materials, and at what size range even is something we really are working on. And then there are other sources that haven't really been considered. We published a paper quite a while back now in a Nature journal where we showed that smoked cigarettes really are a huge source of cellulose acetate microfibers into the marine environment. Many argue that cellulose acetate isn't a microplastic as such, but it's still an anthropogenic material being released into the environment from human activity, and in quite large amounts as well. So there are other sources that haven't really been taken fully into account in studies performed to date. And I guess to conclude, from what you'll hear from today's seminar and from our own research, really microplastics are present in all habitats that we've studied, all environments, with particular the marine environment having been the most studied to date. But as we look at other environments, other sources, we see that plastics and microplastics really are a very common and ubiquitous contaminant. Thank you.
Thank you for this really interesting talk, Kevin. So as for all speakers today, Kevin will stay on Zoom now to answer questions that any of you in the audience might have. And then we'll have a Q&A chat at the end of this session as well. So let's move on to the next speaker, Stephen Burrs. Stephen is an early career British marine scientist, driven to contribute to marine conservation through effective research and communication. He's based here at UQ and currently working towards his PhD within Kevin's group and also in collaboration with the University of Exeter. So his PhD is titled Exploring the Nanoscale Surface Interactions of Microplastics in Natural Waters. And today Stephen will discuss public perceptions of microplastics and their behavior in the natural environment. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, cheers for the introduction. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. My name's Steve, and today I'm going to be diving a little deeper into the problem of microplastic pollution, and specifically looking at what behaviour has to do with the issue as well. So this presentation is basically going to reflect the scope of my PhD project, which looks at microplastic pollution, but under the kind of umbrella theme of behaviour relating to a couple of different aspects. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That might sound a little bit abstract at first, so I'm just going to explain that in a little bit more detail. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, so I look at behaviour in the issue of microplastics in two main categories really at the moment. So on one side, I look at the behaviour of microplastic particles themselves, how they actually interact with the ecosystems that they pollute. And on the other hand, I also look at a human element in that, in the public perception of microplastic pollution as an issue as a whole. So this is kind of going to be the overall structure for this short talk today. So yeah, if we go to the next slide. So continuing from Kevin's talk, the story so far, plastics are just everywhere throughout the environment. Regardless of distance from civilization, you can find plastic on the city streets to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is around 11 kilometers below sea level. And then, so these large pieces of plastic that we throw into the environment, they break down and fragment into smaller and smaller particles that we call microplastics and nanoplastics. And one of the main reasons that these particles are of such interest and concern is that they are more easily potentially inhalable and ingestible by organisms in the environment, not only animals, but ourselves as well. We're a part of that. But really, to understand the risk associated with the pollutant, you have to understand two key things. First of which is the exposure, like Kevin said before, and so how much of the pollutant we're being exposed to. And the second is the actual hazard that the pollutant poses to ourselves. So to understand that, we really need to understand the behaviour of microplastics, how they're actually interacting with the environment, but also the organisms that are polluting as well. Oh, thank you. So how do microplastics behave? What do we know? Well, in a nutshell, it's pretty complex. So microplastics can be formed of a whole host of different polymer types, the main chemical structure, which gives them a variety of different properties off the bat. But then in the environment, like Kevin said before, they weather. So primarily through a process we call photooxidation, which is where plastic material at the surface reacts with oxygen in the environment once it's stimulated basically with UV radiation from naturally occurring sunlight. This changes the physical and chemical characteristics of the microplastics. And, oh, sorry, got that from, they also get coated in environmental factors that are in the environment that they're polluting as well. So all this gives microplastics potentially a whole host of different characteristics, which mean ultimately potentially they can have different behaviours, which is important for when we try to define the actual hazard that microplastics pose. The problem is that although a lot of research has been done around this topic on microplastics, much of it has been done on relatively clean and what we call virgin microplastic material, not necessarily reflecting what we find in the environment, which is an issue because it means potentially we're not accurately being able to define the hazard and therefore the risk associated. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, so what am I actually doing about this? So the area, the part of my research that's focused on this is basically interested in how the weathered characteristics of microplastics influences their subsequent interactions with environmental factors that you find in the environment, so different chemicals and such. So what I'm doing about this basically is I take a known content of microplastics. So for my studies, I use microplastic beads or nurdles, like Kevin described, and I expose them to weathering conditions. I use an instrument called the weathering chamber, which basically uses a UV lamp with a special filter to replicate naturally occurring sunlight, and in controlled conditions photooxidize my microplastic content. I then characterize my microplastics at the surface physically and chemically. Chemically, I use a technique called FDIR, which basically allows me to measure the oxidation at the surface of my microplastics. But I also physically characterize it using a technique called atomic force microscopy, of which you can see a scan on the left here. And that basically works by, if you imagine the smallest record player you could imagine. So what I mean by this is a record player reads the bumps like a vinyl, like a little needle, physically interacting with the surface. That's what happens with atomic force microscopy. I have an area of my plastic material, and I have a micro-sized needle, and it basically follows the scan of the area that I'm interested in and gives me a method of basically quantifying surface roughness of microplastics. I then expose these weathered microplastics to known quantities of environmental factors in solution. So for my study, I'm interested in proteins and signaling compounds called infochemicals, which is really cool, to measure like the uptake of these chemicals by our microplastics, to try and understand how those surface changes really affect the behaviour and the uptake of chemicals by our microplastics. And I'm hoping that this is going to contribute to our understanding of microplastic behaviour in the environment, to ultimately try and get more accurate risk assessments of microplastics, or try and confirm that in that way. So that's kind of a whirlwind, in a nutshell, version of my research on microplastic particles. I'm now going to start talking about the more human-focused part of that. So if we go to the next slide. So this probably seems like quite the tangent from what I've just said, but I wonder, so for everyone watching at home or at work or wherever your computer is, could you, being honest with yourself, I'm not going to test you, honestly say that you know the exact meaning of these symbols that are in front of you on the screen? So what could they mean? If your answer to this is that a plastic item that's labelled these, if you put it into a recycling bin and it will be recycled and turned into something else, unfortunately you would be incorrect. So from left to right here, we've got a couple of different symbols. First of which is a plastic resin code symbol, which just tells you basically the main polymer type that's in the plastic item. In the middle here, we've got something called a Mobius Loop, which indicates that a plastic item is potentially recyclable, but not that it will be recycled if you put it in a recycling bin. And the one on the right is a European labeling scheme called the Green Dot. And this just indicates that the company that makes the plastic item have financially contributed to plastic recycling in Europe. Now, if all that seems very convoluted and confusing, it kind of should, because they all seem to use the same imagery of the arrows moving like a circular motion, and yeah, you would associate that with recyclability, but potentially that's not what it actually means. This is important because the messages that we put out into the public can affect public perspective on the issue at large, like the environmental issue. And potentially these symbols could be given a false sense of control over the environmental impact of plastic use within the population. So if we go into the next slide. So perspective on an environmental issue like microplastic pollution is important, and it's important to gain an understanding about it because it gives us information about, one, how engaged the public are with the issue at large, whether they're actively engaged or not. But the other really important part is it gives us some insight into how effective our communication tools are for actually communicating accurate information to the public and how that's received. So if we go into the next slide. So the part of the research that focuses on this in my PhD project. So I'm working with collaborators at UQ who are involved in social sciences and the humanities, who are really great. We're basically distributing an online questionnaire survey around the Australian population to try and work out what the Australian public actually think about microplastic pollution, the issue as a whole. And we're trying to survey in four main themes. So first of which is the threat of microplastic pollution. What kind of threat do they feel? How do they perceive that? How much control do they think they have of the issue? How much progress do they think has been made on the issue of microplastics? Sorry. And how much hope do they think, and how much hope do they have that the issue is going to be solved basically in the future effectively? So if we go to the next slide. Ultimately, we're hoping that this is going to inform better communication with the public relating to microplastic pollution, but also other environmental issues as well, not only from our perspective from the scientific community to the public, but also within other streams such as tools and schemes that are made by government and industry to try and relay the information that we collect and try and effectively communicate accurate information, or as accurate as possible. If we go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's all me done. Sorry for such a whirlwind, but yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this really interesting and passionate talk, and for all the work you do in this space as well. So if you have any questions for Stephen, please pop them in the Q&A chat now, and we'll go back to it at the end of this session. So our third speaker is joining us all the way from the UK at a really early hour. So we're especially grateful to have her presenting to us, considering the time difference. So Francisca Ribeiro is currently completing her PhD in the Queensland Alliance for Environmental Health Sciences unit and in collaboration also with the University of Exeter, where she is at the moment. She is interested in understanding the effects and risks of contaminants to the marine environment, and in particular, Francisca's PhD investigates the risks of dietary exposure to microplastics through seafood. And she develops techniques to assess and report plastic concentration in edible portions of different seafood species. And this will be also the topic of her contribution today. Thank you, Francisca.
Thank you for this nice introduction. My name is Francisca, and I'm here today to talk about microplastics in seafood, but particularly the work we've been doing at our center over the past 3 years. Next slide, please. So I would like you to look at this credit card, which is a plastic credit card, and think of yourself eating one every week. It does sound like a little bit extreme, but in fact, the Worldwide Fund report for Nature from 2019 states that an average person could be ingesting approximately 5 grams of plastic every week due to inhalation, eating, and drinking. Next slide. And included in the eating, we have seafood. And if you do a quick search online for microplastics in seafood, you'll probably find some of these news almost every week. Something like, what is the future of fish and chips if we don't protect our oceans? Fish for dinner, your seafood might come with a side of plastic. Love oysters, is likely you're eating lots of plastic too as ecological threat grows. And so this clearly shows there is a growing concern of the potential exposure to microplastics as general consumers and seafood eaters. Next slide. But the key question here is, what are the sources of plastic to seafood? Because most of us think that they mainly come from the water while the animal is still alive, and that's true. So they can uptake micro and nanoplastics from the water, as Kevin mentioned in his talk, or either by trophic transfer, so by eating a prey that is contaminated by microplastics, although this hasn't been fully validated yet. But there are also other equally important sources that we need to consider, such as aquaculture and fisheries, for example, so contamination from the fishing ponds, fishing nets, and all the fishing gear associated, deposition by air. So as Kevin mentioned, one of the biggest sources of microplastics is microfibers that are in the air we breathe. So we can actually have deposition of these microfibers in our seafood species. And then, of course, packaging and handling of the seafood specimens once they are caught, freshly caught from the sea, until they get to the retailers and finally to the fish shops. Next slide. And yeah, when we started our studies on microplastics in seafood 2 or 3 years ago, there were already some studies on microplastics and a little bit of information on the topic. And the same report from WWF stated that shellfish in particular, so shellfish is everything that has a shell, mussels, oysters, can contribute to an ingestion of 0.5 grams of plastic a week. Another study that had a lot of attention a few years ago from Van Kouwenberg states that a seafood eater can be ingesting up to 11,000 particles of microplastics per year. The FAO report stated that among 25 species contributing to global sea fishing, 11 contain microplastics. And in fact, all of this evidence can be concerning because seafood represents about 70% of the total animal protein consumed globally. And especially in Australia, seafood is among one of the most foods ingested by the general population. But what we needed to know is exactly how much. Next slide. And so we wanted to know how much. So how much are we exactly being exposed to? And so we wanted to develop a technique or a method that would be simpler for the extraction of these microplastics in our seafood samples, and especially from edible portions of seafood. We also wanted to optimize the identification and quantification of different polymer types through a mass-related quantification approach. And here, what I mean by this is in a unit that is familiar to everyone, like milligrams per grams, for instance. And finally, provide a more efficient environmental reporting of microplastics concentration with these units of reporting. And so in a unit that it's accessible to everyone. Next. And so we decided to go to the fish shop, a local fish shop, and we bought some of the seafood species that are most consumed by Australians. So we bought squid, oysters, blue crabs, king prawns, and sardines, and as a general consumer, and we brought these specimens with us to the lab. In the lab, we process our samples. I can go into very detail about the method, but I'm happy to take any questions at the end. But we basically turn our samples in this seafood soup that you see here in the photo. We filter them, we extract the plastic content, and we analyze by pyrolysis GCMS, as Kevin mentioned in his first talk. And then we get the results for each plastic type and the total plastic content found in each sample. And what you can see here is that, so we consider, we selected an average serving for each species analyzed. So for squid, 4 specimens, oysters 10, prawns 5, and so on, as you can see here on the photo. And what you can see is that when you eat a serving of squid, you can be potentially be exposed to 0.7 milligrams of plastic. For oysters, 0.7 as well. For prawns, 1.1. A blue crab, 3 milligrams. And for sardines, 30 milligrams. But I want you to think of the report that I mentioned at the start that stated that particularly shellfish could contribute to 0.5 grams of plastic ingestion a week. Well, according to our results, you would need to ingest about 10,000 oysters a week to actually get that ingestion that the report states. So the good news here is that the values that we found in our study are much lower than we were expecting, but I have to highlight that's probably because they were sourced from the coast of Australia that is expected to be more clean. Next slide. Okay, so we assessed the microplastic content in these specimens, right? But then we wanted to go a little bit further and try to assess the nanoplastic content. So that fraction of plastics that it's below 1 micrometer in size. And so we built these plastic-free cages so we wouldn't contaminate our samples, and we decided to buy oysters from a farm and then to put them in these cages and deploy them. So put them underwater at the port of Brisbane. So if you're not familiar with the area, it's at the mouth of the Brisbane River, as you see here on the map. And then we left the cages submerged for 14 days. And the reason we did this was because, as you could see from our previous studies, these oysters were actually very clean in terms of plastic contamination. So we wanted them to filter the water and be underwater for 14 days to be polluted for analysis and for the method we wanted to apply. Next slide. And so how could we assess the nanoplastics content? And so for these oysters, after we took them from the water, we took them to the lab, we processed them exactly the same way as we did before. And then we size fractionated our plastics into different fractions. So more than 22 micrometers, 1 to 22 micrometers, and the nanoplastics fraction less than 1 micrometer in size. And what it was very interesting to see is that there was an increase of the plastic content after deployment, as we were expecting. But more than that, there was an increase of the plastic content in the lowest fractions. So the fraction of 1 to 22 and the fraction of the nanoplastics, and also an increase in the variability of the plastic types in these oysters. Next slide. And so with these two studies, our take-home message really is that reporting a plastic mass-related concentration is a step forward towards standardizing methods for microplastic detection and reporting in food, not just seafood, because it's a easy unit of reporting and easily understandable by everyone. And it can actually give us a better measure of what we are being exposed to. And identifying and quantifying the nanoplastics fraction in these samples is key in future studies. And the reason why I say this is because as we've seen before, the nanoplastics fraction is the one that has the most potential to be toxic to both marine organisms and to us as consumers. And it would be interesting to understand in the future the source of this plastic contamination to seafood, because if we understand the source, we can actually tackle the problem and avoid an increased potential exposure in the future. Next slide, please. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francisca. Quite concerning. Yes. Okay. If you have questions for Francisca, also please pop them in the chat and we'll go through them in the Q&A session at the end. So let's move on to our last speaker for the day. Heidi Tate is the co-founder and CEO of the Tangaroa Blue Foundation. The foundation is a response to address the ever-increasing threat of marine debris in our oceans on marine life. Through the foundation, Heidi introduced the Australian Marine Debris Initiative, which is a network of communities, schools, industries, and government agencies, as well as individuals focused on reducing marine debris washing into our oceans. Heidi was also named as one of the 18 most influential women in ocean conservation in July 2018 of Ocean Geographic. So welcome, Heidi. We are very excited to have you join here for this event today.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I'd also just like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Gi and Ngaro people of the land on which I'm sitting on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to everybody. My name is Heidi Tate. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of the Tangaroa Blue Foundation. And just as a quick overview of who we are, we're a national NGO. We started on the marine debris issue back in 2004. And our focus is not only on the removal of what's already out there, but also the prevention of how do we stop the stuff at the source moving forward. We work very closely with a national network of community, industry, government and partners, all working on those priorities. We are aligning, of course, our work not only at a very local scale, but up through to the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well. So a real scalable model. Next slide, thank you. So the Australian Marine Debris Initiative is the program that we primarily focus on, or we coordinate through that network. And it has 6 main components of it, and they all need to happen if we're going to address marine debris holistically. and also monitor the impact of any intervention strategies that are put in place. So we start off with our cleanup events. And when we first started, we were primarily focusing on the beach, but now we actually have cleanup events happening in all types of wet environments, whether that's beaches, rivers, even stormwater assets, to really track that flow of litter into the marine environment. So the cleanups are primarily done by volunteers or partner organisations, and not only do they remove all the debris that they can, and we focus primarily on macro items, so greater than the 5 millimetres for the AMD database. So they sort and count those. There's about 140 categories in the Australian Marine Debris Initiative database, and that database was developed to try and identify the source of the item. So that's how the categories were designed. Those items then feed into the database either through our data collection app or through the website portal. We use that data to identify what items are impacting different parts of Australia. And when we look at the data from Cape York is completely different to what we might find along the Brisbane River or Port Phillip Bay. So we need that data to be really strategic when identifying also mitigation strategies. One thing is not going to fix the problem all over the place. So we track to the source, we figure out what stakeholders do you need at the table to propose solutions, and we implement these source reduction plans that aim to stop at the source. And then, of course, we keep working with cleanups and data collection to monitor the impact. Did we actually get it right? Is it making the outcome that we wanted, or do we need to tweak it or go back to the drawing board? So it needs to continually go around and expand the network if we're going to address all the different types of sources of marine debris. Next slide, thanks. And we were very excited a couple of years ago. We've got this data collection app, which is available to be downloaded by both on Android and iPhone. And it's used by individuals who monitor their own little patch, as well as other community groups, government agencies and universities that we work with on the students. Next slide. So a little bit of a update of where we got to since 2004. We now have data collected from almost 4,000 cleanup sites around Australia, and very excited that those include some of the most remotest parts of Australia, as well as areas where we have lots of volunteers and lots of activity happening as well. And so that map is quite overwhelming when we look at it, because we think about that one little spot that it started, which was actually in the southwest corner of Western Australia all those years ago. And next slide. And a couple of other our milestones from the databases, where well over 18 million data points. Represented in that is almost 2,000 organisations that are contributing to that database. So definitely not just a Tangaroa Blue effort, but all those partners inputting into the database. There's almost 25,000 cleanups and over 500,000 volunteers hours. So a lot of effort, collaboration and partnerships to develop this network. But most importantly, it's resulted in almost 300 individual source reduction plans. And some of those are at a very local scale, and some of them are at a national scale. And I wanted to show you a couple of those that we've implemented that relate to microplastics that have come out of the database. Next point, please. The most important thing, I guess, with the data is to show that almost 75% on average is plastic items. So that's our biggest problem. That statistic can be well up into the 90s when we go into very remote areas like Cape York. And the majority of the items up there is actually fragmented plastics. And that's the degradation of plastic. And it really gives the true indication of legacy of plastic items that are discarded into the environment. This is just what happens to them. You know, one piece today can be 10 pieces next week, and 100 pieces next month, and 1,000 pieces next year. And that's the really challenging thing, because it's much more difficult, time consuming and expensive to pick up a water bottle that's actually 1,000 pieces of water bottle rather than just picking up one water bottle. So the cleanup effort's really important in reducing the degradation and that microplastic load. but also finding ways to stop the loss of those items at the source. And I'm engaging and requesting, if there's one thing that people take away from this presentation today, is we're trying to really discuss or explain about what happens to plastics in the environment in a different way. And so we're encouraging people to talk about plastic breaking up and not plastic breaking down. Because if an item breaks down, the general public thinks that eventually goes away, it causes less harm, and eventually the problem doesn't exist anymore. Whereas we know from the discussions that we've heard just before, that when plastic breaks up into smaller and smaller pieces, it actually creates more and more problems and issues. So it becomes a bigger problem. So just a change in language can really help the general public understand what we're talking about as far as this legacy goes into the environment. And this picture really, really showcases that. Next slide, thanks. And so one of the things that we identified pretty early on was a type of microplastic that we were finding on beaches in the southwest corner of Western Australia, which are plastic resin pellets, also known as noodles. And we tracked upstream into major river systems in Perth and around industrial areas, and found out that some of these plastic resin pellets were coming from domestic sources. Plastic resin pellets tend to be between 1 and 5 millimeters in size. They float, so they do travel very, very far distances, and they can be, an international source. But we also found that we were contributing to that load from our domestic plastics industry. We were able to discover a program that was developed in 1992 by the American plastics industry called Operation Clean Sweep. And the goal of that program was zero pellet loss from industry. We were shocked to find out that it wasn't an industry norm in Australia. And we were able to get some funding from the Victorian state government in 2015, and also work together with Chemistry Australia, who's the plastics industry body in Australia, to bring it to Australia. And I'm really excited to say that, 6 years on now, we have over 30 of the major plastics players in Australia, and also 2 of the bigger logistics companies who have signed up as Operation Clean Sweep members, and looking at ways to stop the loss of plastic resin pellets during manufacturing and transportation. And this is a couple of photos of how small spills, which may not trigger compliance responses, can have significant loads being lost into the environment. And most of the plastic resin pellet that's moved around Australia in bulk, in baggage, bag bulk, come in these 1 ton bags. It can be 40 million plastic resin pellets in 1 bag. So it's quite surprising when you see exactly how much is being lost there. Next slide. And one of the things, and I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background, there's people driving up and down my street, causing her to go a bit silly. Next slide, thanks. Oh, sorry, go back one. That was a bit of a delay there. So one of the things that we were really surprised at in Victoria was to find out that plastic resin pellets didn't actually have a compliance response occurring when there was a loss. And the local government thought that it was an EPA issue. EPA thought it was a local government issue, and so nobody was responding to it. And so while we were working really closely with the industry to adopt plastic resin Operation Clean Sweep, we were also working really, really closely with the local government and the Victorian EPA in a compliance response. And in 2018, we were able to get the EPA to actually issue a guidance in handling plastic resin pellets, and the EPA have put their hand up to respond to that from a compliance perspective. And that's really exciting, because while you want the industry to be doing the right thing, you also want the compliance response in case that they don't. So you need to tackle it from both ends. Next slide, thanks. And the EPA has gone over a massive review over the last couple of years. And actually on July 1, a major change is happening where something called a general environmental duty is coming into force. And that means that EPA officers will be able to go on site in any type of business and say, show me the measures that you've put in place that will prevent human and environmental harm. And if a business owner can't show those measures, the EPA will be able to act, as opposed to waiting till there's a pollution spill and then acting. So this is a great way to start working on preventative measures instead of just being very responsive to spills. And we're really encouraged by this and hope the other states review this type of process when they're doing their own internal environmental regulation changes. Next slide, thanks. And very exciting as well was when they released the National Plastics Plan just recently, we've been able to get Operation Clean Sweep actually listed as an action in the National Plastics Plan. So this will help now take the trial that we rolled out in Victoria to a national scale, and this is exactly where it needs to be. This needs to be industry best practice. It needs to be an industry norm. It's something that industry should already be doing, and now we start to shine a light on it. We hope that that will show the industry really getting on board with this at a national level. So anybody handling plastic resin pellets that you guys know, get them to have a look at the Operation Clean Sweep website and sign up, which doesn't have any cost associated with it, and a lot of resources to stop the loss of plastic resin pellet flake and powder entering into the environment. I just have another couple of slides, and they are about other types of microplastic loss. And this is coming under a source reduction plan that we're talking about in regards to fit for purpose. And one of the things that's really concerning is the use of rubber crumb, which is Australia's answer to our growing tyre problem. What do we do with it? Oh, let's shred it up and make softball park kind of surfaces for it. This photo shows you what can actually happen to the edges of those rubber crumb parks, which is just releasing this type of item back into the environment. So we're doing a bit of research on this project at the moment, and looking at informing government, because it's a big investment in tyre recycling at the moment, and we question whether this is fit for purpose. Next slide. This rubber crumb, which is a form of rubber crumb which has a plastic coating on it that we've discovered is also used in water parks. And you can see that the loss of this type of product into the environment also shows that it's not fit for purpose. You know, this particular park is within 10 metres of the ocean, and there's nowhere for this product to go once it starts to fragment and break up then into the environment. Next slide. We also show plastics being recycled into things like park benches, bollards and decking. Again, we would question whether this is fit for purpose. Plastic doesn't do very well when you stick it in UV or high UV areas, and then under high and low temperature changes, and you can see the plastic just fragmenting out of these particular products. So is this what we should be recycling plastic into? And we would say no, that this is not fit for purpose. And my last slide is that water park, just showing the damage that's done to this water park. We did a bit of research and found that this water park is actually less than 12 months old. So that's pretty shocking. It shows you that it's definitely not a fit for purpose product. So I hope that that was of interest. Last slide is just a thank you slide with our website. Anybody interested in getting involved from either a volunteer on the ground or a professional volunteer, please let us know and get in contact. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Lots of challenges, but also some solutions. That's great to see, and lots of activity going on in that space as well. So a big thank you to all our speakers today, and for taking time out of their day, and in Francisca's case also the night, to present their wonderful findings and interesting research in this space, and local actions and national actions, and the knowledge that they shared on microplastics within our environment. So we now have some time for a short Q&A session with all our speakers. So if you would like to pose any questions for the whole group, please put them in the chat now, and we'll be monitoring the chat and read them out to our speakers, to our experts. Yes, so let's open up for questions.
I have a quick question just to get us all started, this is for all of you. If you could choose one point for attendees to take away from this seminar, what would that point be? Shall we start with Kevin?
One point to take away from this seminar. I think the point I would say is that we all have a responsibility to try and address the issue of plastics pollution, and I think whatever small that contribution is, then it really does matter, because only through everyone coming on board and changing our behaviours towards the use of plastic will we actually address this challenge.
Maybe
Awesome.
Stephen next.
Well, I would say, especially regarding food and seafood in general, make wiser choices in your everyday life. That would be my advice. Try to avoid any potential contamination from plastic utensils in your kitchen. Know the source of your of the seafood you're buying. Try to avoid any potential contamination, increased contamination that your samples might already have some plastics, so try to avoid any plastic utensils. That would be my guess.
Mine would be mainly just, I mean, like both Francisca and say, just every little thing that you can do, it definitely helps. You might not think it in the grand scheme of things, but it definitely does. It takes everyone to kind of pull together and do. Can I not hit the key? Not hear me? Yeah, just reducing the amount of single use that you can, where you can, is just the best thing. That would be the one thing. That would be the one point.
And Heidi, you kind of already gave it away, but if there was a second point you would want to highlight, what would it be?
Look, I would just say that there is so much investment in plastics and recycling at the moment coming out there. And unfortunately, there's a lot of greenwash as companies try and jump on the marketing bandwagon. So just because you can make something out of recycled plastic doesn't mean that we should be making it out of there. And the question of whether it's fit for purpose and not going to cause harm, both environmental and human, needs to be asked, and it's currently not. So don't get bought into the greenwash of what you're finding on your social media feeds, that you think you're doing the right thing by buying something. Ask those extra questions to make sure it's actually not just greenwash. There's too much out there.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point that we need to keep in mind and make wiser consumer choices as well. I have another question, Heidi. How can the general public get involved in the different things you do with Tangaroa Blue?
Lots of different options. So our bigger cleanup events are always on our website, so people can just volunteer for that. If people are interested in setting up their own small monitoring site that they do on a more regular basis, then we have those tools and we can help them set that up as well. And then we have a professional volunteering program as well. So if people don't necessarily want to go and pick up rubbish, but they want to help us in the data, the research, where I guess our biggest capacity gap is writing up all our data. And we're always looking for science people that can help us dive into the data for different projects and use the data. That's what it was collected for. So there's lots of opportunities at all those different scales.
That's great. Thank you.
Amazing. And I have a final question, which actually is coming from Monica Janda in the question and answer panel. So she says, for all speakers, what is the best, so you've already given approaches to reduce plastic and microplastic creation in individual actions, but what would be the best approach to reduce microplastics, given that some of the sources are not from individual use, but society in general? How would you go about tackling those issues on an individual scale, if we can, at this point in time?
Oh, look, I'm happy to jump in first if everyone's thinking about it. Look, I would just say supply chains have to be held accountable. And so if you're going to go and buy something, then, do a bit of due diligence. It's like what we've been talking about with government investment at the moment. If you have a company that you're going to give money to and you don't hold them to best practice, then that's not good for taxpayer money. Like, we should be saying that companies don't get funding if they're not part of Operation Clean Sweep for a program, because that's best practice. So that's an example. So I guess it's the same thing, is just to make sure that when you're consuming, that you are doing your due diligence and investing in best practice. And that can be scalable. It can be from what you buy on a day-to-day basis up to, whatever your business is, how that influences its procurement processes. And that's how we shift the norm and the social norm changes. At the moment, we buy things that are cheap, convenient and easy, and this is why we're in the position that we're in. So we need to shift that consuming behaviour, and it can be done at all levels.
I guess my response is not at the individual level, but I really think we need to use the valuable resources that are used into making plastics kind of for the value that they are. Tamara Galloway, our collaborator in Exeter, that's co-supervisor Francisca, said something pretty poignant in a Nature News article from last week, where why are we making items that last 500 years to use them for 20 seconds? And I think that's really the point here, is that we're using a very useful material, but we're not using it in the right way. And I think that echoes through today's messaging.
Yeah, that's a really important point, to just use plastic in a smarter way, because it has, especially in the medical field, it has a lot of applications that are important. All right, maybe we have time for one more question from the audience. Sorry, some of them were already answered, I see. Let me see, I don't think, the database is accessible to the public. That's something Heidi mentioned, but also a follow-up question maybe from that. Is there a global database where all these efforts are actually being put together? That's one thing that I find sometimes tricky, that there are so many efforts to just, have the overview and have one central place where this information is gathered.
The answer is no, there's not. It is one of my a constant source of frustration, not necessarily that there's just one database, because there are a lot of questions out there, and as scientists, you know that you can't have necessarily one set of data to answer all your questions. So, it makes sense that different questions are being collected with data collected slightly different ways. But at least let's agree on terminology and categories and things like that, so that even if it's not in one spot, it can still talk to each other. And that's what we've been really trying to advocate over a really long time, is that consistent language.
Yeah, little changes go a long way. Great. All right. So that actually wraps up our group Q&A session, and actually our seminar on microplastics today. I would really like to thank everyone involved for attending, and especially our speakers, and also the UQ Sustainability Office, and particularly Emily Conn, who has actually organized all this, and also UQ Marine. So this discussion will be posted online, and we really hope that you gain some better understanding of the microplastics problem, and that you now go away with some more knowledge about the challenges, but also the solutions, and communicate those with your environment. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.